You will obey
A
my
Navy
orders
SEAL
without
ordered her
question,
aside.
recruit.
Then the commander
My
dropped his
conviction is
hat
stronger than
and
your
saluted
authority,
her in
sir.
silence.
That is enough.
The training room smelled of floor wax and
We
cold
need to move the
fluorescent
convoy
light,
immediately,
the kind that
Captain.
made every crease of
Position
a
is
uniform look
compromised.
sharper than it
Understood,
really
Sergeant.
was.
We'll be ready inside
Boots
5
lined the
minutes.
rows tall,
Data confirms
squared,
imminent launch
disciplined.
capabilities. We
And
have
in the
to
middle
assume
of
they are
them,
targeting the
she
fleet.
moved like she
Prepare the
didn't belong
countermeasure
to the
protocol.
noise,
Execute
only to the
immediately.
work in her hands.
We have to get
She
this
didn't
done
look
before
up when the
sunrise.
Navy SEAL
The
barked
timing
at
is
her.
critical.
He stepped
We
forward,
won't fail. The
broad-shouldered,
team is ready for
impatient,
deployment.
the kind of man used to
We
owning
know
every
you were
inch of
involved.
space he
Start
walked into.
talking now.
Step
I have
aside,
nothing to say
he
to you
growled,
people. You
as if
can't
she were
make
just
me.
another piece of
This
equipment
is your
blocking
last
his path.
chance.
She
We're
didn't
running out of
answer.
time. We have to move
No
faster.
protest, no pause,
That building is a
only
fortress.
procedure. Her
We have our
fingers
orders.
adjusted
We're
the
going
loose
in.
button on her shirt, an automatic, almost invisible gesture, revealing a glimpse of ink against her skin. Wings, symmetrical, sharp, and a number beneath them. The flash lasted no more than a breath, but it was enough to pull the air taut in the room. One soldier in the back stiffened, like his memory had betrayed him for a second. The others didn't notice, or pretended not to. To them, she was just logistics. A background figure assigned to clear the room, arrange the binders, keep order while the real warriors trained. A staffer among operators. A ghost in a place built on noise. But there was something about the way she moved a precision, too clean, too practiced, too economical to belong to someone who lived her life behind a desk. Every motion deliberate, every breath measured, as if her body still remembered a rhythm no one else in the room could hear. The SEAL scoffed, shaking his head as if offended by her calm. "You hear me? Move." "Oh." She shifted only enough to finish what she was doing, smoothing a sleeve, aligning a clipboard, and the stillness frustrated him even more. The room felt smaller, tighter, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. A murmur passed through the formation. Not loud enough to be speech, more like a ripple. Someone said he'd seen that patch before. Someone else hissed for him to shut up. A third soldier stared at the ink beneath her collar as if he were staring at a ghost story whispered in the barracks years ago. The door at the back opened. The commander stepped in. Conversation stopped instantly. Even Boots seemed to fall silent. His presence carried weight 30 years, multiple deployments, a resume of war etched in posture alone. He scanned the room once, the disciplined sweep of someone who had trained generations of fighters. Then his gaze landed on her. It didn't leave. The SEAL straightened, instantly snapping into respect, convinced the commander was here to reprimand her for being in the way. But the commander walked past him without acknowledgement, past the rows of soldiers, past the front table, straight toward her. She finally looked up. For a moment, the world slowed, light bending, sound thinning, and the commander saw what no one else had processed yet. The ink, the wings, the number, the silent posture, and the look in her eyes. Recognition hit him like a blast wave. His hat slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor. Then he saluted. Not a small salute, not a courtesy. A full, deliberate, reverent salute, one that froze every man in the room where he stood. The SEAL, who had barked orders at her, went pale. Soldiers behind him stiffened as if a secret had just stepped out of its grave. Someone whispered a name, half fear, half awe, but the sound died before it formed fully. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply held the commander's gaze with a calmness no ordinary staffer could ever carry. And in that silence, every soldier understood one thing. She was not who they thought she was. She never had been. The commander's salute still hung in the air like a suspended verdict, and the soldiers stood frozen as though the walls themselves had tightened around their chests in an attempt to understand what had just taken place. The woman at the center of the room remained still, her breathing steady and precise, as if she had trained her entire life to withstand moments exactly like this, without revealing even the slightest tremor of emotion. The SEAL, who had barked at her moments earlier, tried to reclaim his composure, yet his eyes darted uneasily between the commander's rigid posture and the quiet figure who had become the unwilling center of the room's collapsing hierarchy. His jaw tensed, as if preparing an explanation that his pride refused to allow him to voice, but his silence only made the tension grow sharper. The commander didn't speak right away, choosing instead to study her expression with the kind of scrutiny reserved only for those whose reputation has outgrown their recorded history. His features shifted minimally, but the flicker of recognition in his eyes betrayed the surge of memories rising from a long-buried past. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reverent, yet edged with disbelief that seemed to fracture the room's already unstable balance. "Where have you been?" he asked, not as an accusation, but as a question a soldier asks when confronted with a ghost he thought he buried years ago. His words carried across the room, cutting through the stale air and landing heavily on the ears of those who suddenly realized they were witnessing something far beyond their rank or clearance. She didn't answer immediately, simply holding his gaze with a calm that felt both human and inhuman at the same time, the kind of calm forged in places where seconds decided lives, and silence was a form of survival rather than a choice. Her eyes carried a depth that suggested she had seen more than anyone in the room would ever comprehend, yet she offered no explanation, no apology, and no justification for her presence. The commander stepped closer, lowering his salute slowly, as if returning from a distant battlefield that only he could still see, and his voice softened into something almost fragile when he spoke again. "We were told no one survived," he murmured, the sentence cracking at the edges like a classified report that had been folded and unfolded too many times. A ripple passed through the room as soldiers exchanged quick glances, each trying to decipher whose survival he was referring to and why it mattered enough to make a veteran commander's voice falter. Behind them, the SEAL shifted his weight awkwardly, his bravado leaking away until nothing remained but the realization that he had shouted at someone the commander clearly regarded with a level of respect no ordinary soldier could ever earn. His throat tightened with the bitter taste of humiliation, yet he stood rooted in place, unable to decide whether he should apologize, retreat, or simply remain silent and hope the moment swallowed him whole. The woman finally inhaled, slow and controlled, and the room seemed to inhale with her as if unconsciously following her lead. Her voice, when it emerged, carried the steady cadence of someone accustomed to speaking only when necessary, measured and cool, lacking any anger, fear, or justification. "I stayed where I was needed," she said, her words landing with a weight that suggested stories too dense for the room's oxygen to contain. The commander closed his eyes briefly, as though her answer had dragged him back into a memory marked by dust, fire, and a mission number whispered only in the quiet halls of intelligence. "Mission 127, he said quietly, more to himself than to her, and several soldiers gasped softly as the number carved itself into their minds like a myth suddenly made real. "They marked every operative as Kia," he added, his voice tightening, "and the files were sealed before we could ask why." End of quote. The room shifted as understanding settled uncomfortably among them, and the soldiers who had watched her with suspicion moments earlier now struggled to reconcile the quiet staffer in front of them with the ghost of a classified unit thought lost to time. Their posture straightened instinctively, respect replacing doubt, and the SEAL felt the weight of his own ignorance clamp down on him like a steel shackle he could not break. Her gaze drifted briefly toward the doorway as though she were calculating exits, contingencies, and variables invisible to ordinary eyes, before returning to the commander with the same steady composure she had shown since the beginning. "The mission didn't end where they said it ended," she replied, her voice soft yet unyielding. "And the things we carried couldn't be written into any report." Her words hinted at shadows, betrayal, and the kind of truth that governments buried under layers of redacted lines and sealed archives. The commander swallowed hard, the realization dawning that she had not simply survived, she had endured something far beyond the scope of any operation he had overseen. He stepped back, not out of fear but out of reverence, granting her space the way a soldier clears room for someone whose presence demands distance. "You weren't meant to be found," he whispered, his tone carrying a mixture of awe and sorrow. She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his statement, yet she neither confirmed nor denied it, her silence becoming a shield that concealed more than it revealed. The room remained painfully still, the soldiers unsure whether to speak, move, or breathe, and every second stretched into something that felt almost ceremonial. The SEAL finally lowered his gaze, surrendering the last fragments of his pride as he understood the magnitude of his mistake. The commander straightened once more, recalibrating himself with the discipline of a man who had spent decades carrying the burden of authority, and when he addressed the room, his voice regained the steel that had shaped generations of warriors. "Stand at attention," he commanded, and the soldiers reacted instantly, the sharp sound of boots snapping together echoing like a reaffirmation of order. "You are in the presence of someone whose service predates every one of you," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the room with the force of a gale. She did not acknowledge the gesture, did not revel in the respect, and did not allow even the faintest flicker of ego to show upon her face. Instead, she calmly rolled her sleeves back down, covered the inked wings and the infamous number beneath them, and resumed the same quiet posture she had held before the room erupted around her. The gesture was subtle, almost gentle, yet it carried more dignity than any rank or medal ever could. And as the silence settled once more, every soldier in the room realized a truth that would follow them long after they left that building. She had not come to be recognized. She had not come to be honored. She had only come because the mission, whatever it truly was, had never really ended. The training room slowly regained the ability to breathe, yet every inhale carried a tremor of unease as soldiers attempted to comprehend how a quiet logistics staffer could command a salute from a decorated commander without uttering a single word. The SEAL, who had barked at her moments ago, stood rigid with a stiffness born not from discipline but from the realization that he had shouted at someone whose story was carved far deeper into the history of their branch than his own would ever be. The commander kept his gaze fixed on her, as though afraid she might vanish again if he looked away even for an instant, and the silence stretched long enough for distant hallway footsteps to echo faintly through the reinforced walls. One of the younger soldiers near the back whispered to the man beside him, asking whether the number beneath her collar matched the rumors about a covert unit that had vanished during a classified operation overseas, and his friend responded with a subtle shake of the head, too afraid to voice the truth he suspected. Their hushed exchange rippled outward, creating a muted wave of speculation that clung to the air like dust disturbed by an unexpected draft, forming a cloud of fear, respect, and curiosity that no one dared fully inhale. The commander stepped closer again, though not with the authority of a superior officer, but with the cautious reverence of someone approaching an artifact thought lost to time, and his voice dropped to a tone that carried the weight of memory rather than command. "They told us 127 never made it past the ridge," he murmured, each syllable dragging pieces of an old nightmare back into the light, and the soldiers nearest to him stiffened, as the name of the mission ignited fragments of rumors they had only heard in late-night barracks whispers. She met his gaze without flinching, her eyes holding the steady composure of someone who had carried burdens heavier than any report could capture, though her silence hinted at truths too dangerous to speak aloud. The SEAL swallowed hard, a knot forming at the base of his throat as he realized the insignificance of his earlier arrogance, and he shifted uncomfortably under the intensity of a moment he knew he had no right to occupy. His mind raced through every interaction he had witnessed that morning, searching for signs he should have noticed earlier. But all he found was a relentless regret pounding in his chest with each passing second. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize, or perhaps to ask the questions burning behind his eyes. Yet no sound emerged, because something in the way she stood warned him that his voice would only fracture the fragile gravity of the room. One of the senior NCOs stepped forward cautiously, his expression strained with the responsibility of needing answers, while balancing the fear of asking questions that might jeopardize his clearance. "Ma'am," he began hesitantly, though he clearly had no idea what rank or title to use. "Are you here on assignment, or should we notify command?" She turned her head slightly, acknowledging his presence with a quiet respect that felt strangely disarming, and her voice, when it finally returned, carried an undertone of exhaustion that suggested years spent in places far beyond official oversight. "No notification is needed," she said gently, though her words contained a firmness that made clear the matter was not open for further discussion, and several soldiers exchanged glances that reflected equal parts confusion and awe. The commander drew a slow, heavy breath, as if preparing himself to reopen wounds he had spent years stitching shut, then addressed the room with a solemnity that made the fluorescent lights seem dimmer. "I want every man here to understand something," he declared, his voice carrying the cold certainty of battlefield truth. "If she is standing in this room today, then everything we were told after 127 was a lie." The soldiers reacted with a mix of shock and dread, their posture tightening as though preparing for a threat they could not yet name, and the SEAL's eyes widened with a belated realization that he had stumbled into a legacy of operations so deeply buried that even senior officers refused to speak of them. She watched them carefully, her expression unreadable, and with each passing second, the quiet dignity of her presence seemed to draw a sharper contrast between the version of her they had assumed and the truth she refused to reveal. Someone near the front finally gathered enough courage to ask the question that had begun to pulse through the entire room. "Ma'am, what really happened out there?" The words hung fragile and trembling between them, as if the very air feared the answer. She exhaled slowly, and the room exhaled with her, the collective breath forming an invisible thread that tied every soldier's attention directly to her next sentence. "What happened," she said after a long pause, "was not supposed to survive." Her tone carried layers of fatigue, defiance, and quiet sorrow, and a chill rippled through the formation as they tried to decipher whether she was referring to the mission, her team, or herself. The commander bowed his head slightly, as though confirming a truth he had always suspected but never dared accept, and his voice shook when he finally spoke again. "They buried your unit before we even finished the search," he said, each word striking the room like the slow toll of a ceremony bell. "They erased everything." As she shifted her stance subtly, not in discomfort but in a way that suggested she was preparing herself to face a memory she had spent years trying to outrun, and the faint tremor of tension that crossed her features lasted only a second before dissolving back into the rigid discipline of a soldier trained to withstand far worse than questions. "Erasing something," she replied with a quiet resolve, "doesn't mean it stops existing." The soldiers absorbed this cryptic truth with wide, uncertain eyes, while the commander nodded with an understanding that came from surviving his own share of redacted pages and sealed archives. Beyond the windows, a low rumble of distant machinery echoed across the base as aircraft were prepared for afternoon drills, and the sound seemed to underscore the gravity of the conversation unfolding inside the room. She glanced toward the noise briefly, then returned her focus to the soldiers, her expression sharpening with an alertness that suggested she was already analyzing patterns no one else could see. "If I am here," she continued, her voice tightening slightly, "it is because something has shifted." The commander stiffened, and several soldiers instinctively reached for their belts as though expecting an immediate threat, though none dared act without instruction. "Shifted how?" the NCO asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of caution and anticipation. She hesitated only long enough to choose her words carefully, then answered with a clarity that made every muscle in the room tense. "The past," she said, "has started moving again." And with that single sentence, every man in the room understood that whatever mission she had survived was not finished, and whatever force had tried to bury it was now coming back into the light. The room fell into an uneasy stillness after her final sentence, and for several long moments, no one dared to shift their weight or adjust their stance, because something in her voice suggested that speaking too soon would fracture a truth held together only by silence and gravity. The commander remained motionless with his hands clasped behind his back, yet his breathing had grown heavier, as if hearing her words had torn open a sealed compartment in his memory that he had spent years trying to lock away. The soldiers watched both of them with the wide, unsteady gaze of witnesses who knew they were standing at the threshold of something larger than rank, clearance, or protocol could ever contain. She closed her eyes briefly, and the room seemed to dim around her, as though the fluorescent lights were retreating in respect for the shadows rising behind her expression, shadows carrying dust, fire, and the unmistakable weight of a past that had never fully died. When she spoke again, her voice carried the brittle softness of someone recalling events that were not simply painful but fundamentally altering, the kind of memories carved so deeply that speaking them aloud risked reshaping the air itself. "The ridge wasn't the end," she said slowly, her words forming an almost physical presence that settled heavily across the soldier's shoulders and tightened every spine in the room. A faint tremor passed across her hand, so subtle that anyone not paying close attention would have missed it entirely. Yet that single flicker revealed more than any story could, because it hinted at a burden she had carried alone for far too long. She lifted her chin slightly, and her gaze drifted toward the corner of the room as if she were watching a memory replay itself across the blank wall. A memory no one else could see, yet everyone felt pressing down on them like a gathering storm. "We were supposed to hold the line until extraction," she continued, her voice gaining a quiet steadiness that hinted at discipline forged in the harsh crucible of impossible odds and silent sacrifices. But extraction never came. The commander flinched almost imperceptibly at those words, as if he had been struck by a memory that had stalked him for years, and his jaw tightened with a guilt he had never allowed himself to express. "We waited for confirmation," he said in a low tone that carried the weight of regret sharp enough to leave scars, "but the comms went dark before we could launch the second rescue team, and higher command ordered the operation sealed. The soldiers exchanged frightened glances as the room shifted from simple curiosity to something closer to reverence, because they now understood they were hearing a story carved from the bones of an operation buried deeper than any classified archive. She inhaled slowly, and the sound of her breath felt heavier than any confession, as though the simple act of remembering required more strength than most men spent in battle, and she opened her eyes with a sharp clarity that made several soldiers instinctively stand straighter. "They cut the feed because someone wanted it cut," she said, her tone hardening with an edge that suggested betrayal layered beneath the dust and smoke of the past. "And when the fire rolled over the ridge, the sky looked like it was swallowing us whole." The SEAL, who had mocked her earlier, felt his stomach twist as he imagined her standing in that inferno, and shame crawled up his spine until he could barely keep his posture steady. For a moment she seemed to drift away from the room, her expression turning inward as if she were walking back through smoke-filled paths only she could see, paths lined with faces that had once lived beside her and whose absence now haunted the angles of her silence. When she continued, her words wove through the room like a slow-moving current, pulling every man into the undertow of a truth they had no training for. "Most of the team didn't fall to the fire," she whispered. "They fell to what came before it, something not listed in any after-action report, because the people who write those reports weren't there to witness what we faced." The commander's eyes widened slightly, and the air thickened with the kind of dread that only grows when soldiers realize a threat was never fully understood or properly identified. "What did you face?" he asked, his voice steadier than the tremor betraying the tension in the muscles around his jaw. She took a slow step forward, her boots barely making a sound against the polished floor, and her gaze sharpened with the precision of someone who had seen the shape of the enemy more clearly than any satellite or drone ever could. "Something that didn't break protocol," she replied, "but something that broke trust." "Oh." The words settled across the room like a silent explosion, leaving every man struggling to understand the implications, and the SEAL felt the humiliation of his earlier arrogance transform into a gnawing fear that he had unknowingly crossed paths with a soldier forged not just by war but by betrayal. The commander pressed his lips together, and his breathing deepened as if preparing for the weight of a truth he had long suspected but had never been allowed to confirm. "Someone on our side did this," he said slowly, not phrasing it as a question but as a conclusion carved from decades of experience navigating the darker corners of military politics. She didn't nod, and she didn't answer directly. Yet the hardness in her gaze served as confirmation sharper than any spoken admission, and several soldiers shifted their weight uneasily as the room filled with a cold realization that the enemy she referred to may have worn the same uniform they did. "We were meant to disappear," she said, her voice carrying the quiet fury of a wound that had never healed, because disappearing kept certain people safe and allowed them to rewrite the story before anyone could question the truth. "Oh." The commander closed his eyes for a moment, as though accepting a burden he had never been able to name but had always felt pressing against the edges of his conscience, and when he opened them again, the resolve in his gaze was stronger than the fear flickering beneath it. "If something has shifted," he said with careful gravity, "then someone is moving against that rewritten story." She stepped back slightly, as if distancing herself from the weight of shared realization, and her voice softened into something almost mournful. "They didn't finish what they started," she murmured, "and unfinished things have a way of resurfacing at the worst possible time." The soldiers listened in total silence, each man sensing that the uncertainty threading through her words signaled the beginning of something far larger than any of them understood. And the SEAL swallowed hard as he realized he was standing on the edge of a story written long before he earned his trident. The base hummed quietly beyond the walls, the distant engines of aircraft rising into the afternoon sky, like a reminder that the world continued to move even as the room's gravity held them suspended in a truth no one wanted but everyone knew they needed to hear. And as she returned her gaze to the commander with a calm that hid more battle scars than any metal could reveal, the room understood one final thing with absolute clarity. The past she carried had not resurfaced by accident, and whatever force had awakened, it was now moving toward them with deliberate, unstoppable intent. The commander had barely absorbed the weight of her final words when a faint disturbance echoed from the hallway, carrying the unmistakable rhythm of boots moving with coordinated urgency, a rhythm that signaled the arrival of officers who did not come when summoned, but came only when something in the system had quietly warned them that a fault line had begun to open. The soldiers shifted their attention toward the doorway instinctively, their posture tightening as though the air itself had begun preparing for impact, and even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum with a sharper intensity, as if anticipating what was about to enter. The woman did not turn her head toward the sound, yet a subtle shift in her shoulders revealed that she had already identified the approaching ranks, calculated their intentions, and assessed their potential threat long before their silhouettes darkened the threshold. The commander inhaled slowly, bracing himself with the awareness that whatever conversation had begun inside this room was about to expand far beyond his control, because the military does not send multiple senior officers without reason, and certainly not to a training room occupied by a woman who was never meant to resurface. 3 figures entered, 2 lieutenant colonels and a rear admiral, each wearing an expression carved from equal parts: authority, confusion, and cold urgency, the kind that only appears when someone above them has whispered a message that carries more weight than explanation. The soldiers snapped to attention automatically, but the admiral raised a hand sharply, halting the gesture mid-motion, his eyes already locked onto the woman standing near the front of the room, with the quiet posture of someone who had once outranked the very people trying to decipher her presence. "Who authorized her access to this facility?" the admiral demanded, his voice carrying the sharpness of a blade pressed too close to the skin, and the question sliced through the room with enough force to drain the color from several young soldiers' faces. The commander stepped forward immediately, positioning himself between the admiral and the woman with a deliberate calm that made the other officers exchange uneasy glances, as though witnessing a violation of the invisible scripts that governed their world. "No authorization was required," the commander replied, his tone deceptively steady, yet threaded with defiance that no one expected from a man known for rigid discipline and impeccable adherence to protocol. The admiral narrowed his eyes, the faintest shadow of irritation crossing his features, and his voice sharpened as he asked, "And why exactly is that, Commander?" The answer hovered in the air like a live wire waiting to strike, and the commander delivered it with a gravity that sent a shiver through every man in the room. "Because her classification level predates this facility." End of credits. The words dropped like a silent detonation, their impact amplified by the way the admiral's expression tightened as he attempted to reconcile what he had heard with the reality standing before him. One of the lieutenant colonels stepped forward cautiously, his gaze flicking toward the number she had concealed beneath her sleeve earlier, and his breath hitched as though he had glimpsed a ghost from a forgotten chapter of intelligence history. "Is that who I think it is?" he whispered to the admiral, his voice barely audible yet sharp enough for every soldier to feel the temperature in the room drop. The admiral didn't answer, but the stiffness in his posture betrayed a recognition he was not prepared to voice. And for a brief moment, the entire hierarchy felt like it was balancing on a fragile edge between disbelief and fear. The woman remained silent throughout the exchange, though the slight tilt of her head suggested she was listening not to their words but to the silence surrounding them, sensing the tension building like pressure beneath reinforced steel. When the admiral finally addressed her directly, his voice carried less hostility and more caution, as though speaking to someone whose history he had only read in heavily redacted reports that still managed to keep him awake at night. "If you are who I believe you are," he said slowly, choosing each word with deliberate care, "then your presence here constitutes a security event of the highest level, and we need to initiate containment protocol immediately." She met his gaze with the calm certainty of someone who had walked through far harsher threats than bureaucratic containment, and her response carried the cool edge of truth cutting through layers of procedure. "Containment applies to threats," she said softly, her voice steady enough to silence the room. "I am not the threat." The admiral opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the emergency intercom crackled faintly above them, releasing a distorted rumble that made several soldiers instinctively tense as though expecting an alarm. The sound faded quickly, yet the timing made the air tighten, suggesting that the system itself had begun to detect something moving beneath the surface. The commander looked up sharply, his instincts firing with the practiced precision of a man who knew how to read the tones beneath an intercom's static, and he exchanged a brief glance with the woman that confirmed they both recognized the pattern. "That wasn't a malfunction," he said quietly, directing his words toward the admiral without breaking eye contact with her. "That was a ping." The admiral stiffened, understanding the implication immediately, and one of the lieutenant colonels stepped toward the wall terminal, typing rapidly as he accessed the internal network. His face paled as the data appeared on the screen, and he turned toward the room with a tension that drew every soldier's heartbeat into a single synchronized pulse. There was an unauthorized query into sealed archives, he said, his voice barely holding steady. Someone tried to access Operation 127. The words cracked through the room like a suppressed explosion, and even the fluorescent lights seemed to flicker in response, as though the whole facility had flinched at the revelation. The Admiral's gaze snapped toward the woman, his earlier caution hardening into urgency. "Is this linked to your presence here?" he demanded, though his tone betrayed a deeper fear that she might confirm the suspicion he had been trying to avoid. She held his stare for a long moment, then answered with a calm so steady it made the room feel suddenly colder. "I didn't come because they looked for me," she said, her voice quiet yet unshakable. "I came because they looked for the truth." The commander's expression tightened as he absorbed her meaning, and the soldiers felt the shift ripple through their ranks like a current passing beneath the floor. "Someone wants to resurrect the mission," she continued, her posture hardening slightly, as if bracing herself against an invisible wind. "And they'll come for anyone who still carries pieces of it." The Admiral swallowed hard, the reality settling heavily across his shoulders, and he turned toward the officers beside him with the urgency of a man who knew the window for action was rapidly closing. "Lock down this facility," he ordered, though his voice wavered for the first time. "No one leaves until we understand what we're dealing with." Yet even as he spoke, the woman's gaze drifted toward the door with a distant, almost sorrowful awareness, as if she already knew the lockdown would be meaningless against whatever force had begun to move. Because the past was not simply resurfacing, it was hunting, and it had already found their trail. The Admiral's order for a lockdown had barely left his lips when the ambient hum of the facility shifted, carrying a deeper resonance that signaled the base's systems had begun rerouting power towards security corridors, a change subtle enough that only those with combat-seasoned instincts would feel its presence pressing lightly against the floor. The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances as the lights above them flickered faintly, creating a heartbeat pattern that pulsed across the room like the tremor of a warning whispered through steel and concrete. The woman remained perfectly still despite the sudden shift in atmosphere, though the commander noticed a slight tightening around her eyes, as if she had already calculated what the lockdown protocols would trigger and whom they would alert beyond the walls of the training room. The Admiral took a single step closer, lowering his voice with the practiced caution of a man aware that every word he spoke from this moment forward would be recorded, monitored, and dissected by individuals far above his pay grade. "If someone is pulling at the threads of 127, he said slowly, choosing each syllable as though navigating a minefield, then they must know you're alive, and they must know the story they buried isn't staying in its grave." His words resonated through the room with a weight that pressed against the soldiers' chests. Yet she didn't flinch, her expression remaining a calm mask sculpted by years of discipline and hidden conflict. The lieutenant colonel at the terminal tapped rapidly at the console, his face turning a shade paler as more classified flags appeared on the screen, each one indicating a level of clearance that none of the officers present were authorized to access. "Sir," he murmured, swallowing hard as he scrolled through the incoming alerts. "There are red seal tags activating across 3 different intelligence branches, and they all reference the same codename, though the system keeps blocking the final designation." The Admiral's breath caught as he leaned closer to the screen, and his voice dropped to a whisper coated in disbelief. "What's the codename they're flagging?" he asked, though something in his tone already betrayed a dawning recognition he was almost afraid to confirm. The NCO hesitated before reading the single phrase that appeared, flickering as though the system itself struggled to display it through layers of suppression. "Widow Protocol." The room seemed to tilt slightly, as though gravity had shifted under their feet, and several soldiers felt a chill crawl up their spines as the meaning seeped into their awareness with the slow inevitability of a blade sliding free of its sheath. The commander exhaled sharply, finally understanding why the Admiral's expression had hardened the moment she spoke of the past moving again, because the Widow Protocol was not a warning signal, but a recognition, a formal acknowledgement of a classified operative, believed dead, yet still possessing information capable of destabilizing entire command structures. The SEAL, who had mocked her earlier, felt his throat constrict as he realized he had shouted at someone whose code name alone was enough to trigger the highest tier of internal alarms, and shame spilled through him with a force that made his hands twitch against his sides. The Admiral straightened slowly, turning to face her with a respect that bordered on unease, and his voice carried an undercurrent of awe when he finally spoke again. "If the system acknowledged you," he said, "then your status was never erased, only buried deeper than anyone realized. She met his gaze with the quiet steadiness of someone who had long understood the permanence of her past role, even as she attempted to live another life far from the shadows of decisions made in sealed chambers. "They buried the file," she replied, her tone soft yet unbendable. "But they couldn't bury the designation, because designations don't die, they wait." Her words settled across the room like a cold wind passing through an open field at night, carrying a truth that felt older than any operation these men had lived through. A sharp buzz from the hallway intercom interrupted the silence, followed by the mechanical sound of reinforced doors sealing in distant parts of the facility, each metallic thud echoing faintly as if marking the approach of something inevitable. The lieutenant colonel checked the terminal again, his expression tightening with worry. "Multiple checkpoints are locking," he reported, "but there's a delay in Wing Bravo, and command access isn't responding as it should." The commander's gaze snapped toward the woman with a knowing glint, because her presence had always carried the implication that the system wasn't failing. It was hesitating, reacting, recalibrating in real time, as it attempted to reconcile the existence of someone it had been instructed never to acknowledge again. "It's reading her," he said quietly, though the weight of his statement made the soldiers shift uneasily, as if witnessing a machine recalibrate its loyalties. The admiral rubbed his hands together slowly, a gesture revealing more tension than authority, and he addressed her with a cautious respect that felt almost ceremonial. "If the system recognizes you," he said, "then it will expect certain commands from you, and if those commands aren't given, someone higher up will try to force a response." She lowered her gaze for the first time, not in submission but in contemplation, the shadows under her eyes deepening with a sorrow that suggested she had hoped this moment would never come. "I didn't return to command anything," she murmured, her voice carrying a fatigue shaped by years of silent survival. "But the system doesn't care what I want, it cares what I was." The soldiers around her felt their breath tighten as they recognized the difference, because wanting and being were two separate states, and the latter always carried the heavier weight. The facility lights flickered again, longer this time, and a low-frequency hum vibrated through the floor, a sign that the base had begun transferring control to a deeper, older protocol that none of the present officers had ever interacted with. The admiral's face paled as he realized the shift. "That's legacy power routing," he said in a strained whisper, "which means something authenticated her at a level we cannot override." The commander stepped toward her, his voice steady but his eyes bright, with a loyalty that transcended rank. "Tell us what you need," he said firmly, his words resonating through the room like a vow. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a calm resolve that made the air feel strangely still, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had once given orders in the ruins of missions the world had never learned about. "What I need," she said slowly, "is time." The admiral shook his head with a grim expression. "Time is exactly what they won't give you," he replied, "because if the protocol is active, someone out there already knows you surfaced." She inhaled deeply, steadying herself against the storm gathering at the edges of her expression, and for the first time her voice carried something almost like dread. "Then they're coming," she said, "and they won't stop until they finish what was started." The room fell into a silence so sharp it felt like a blade pressed against the heart of the base, and every soldier understood the chilling truth. Her return had not triggered the danger. It had merely confirmed it was already on its way. The air inside the training room thickened until every soldier felt as though the walls themselves were listening, absorbing each breath and every tremor of uncertainty as the weight of her presence began radiating outward through the base's internal systems like a pulse none of them could control. The lights dimmed for a brief moment before stabilizing at a lower intensity, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor and emphasized the rigid lines of uniforms now standing far straighter than they had only minutes earlier. The admiral, usually the immovable pillar of authority in any room he entered, shifted his stance with the uneasy awareness of a man who had just discovered that his place in the hierarchy had quietly been rearranged by forces older and deeper than his decades of service. He looked at her with a mixture of respect, fear, and something almost reverent, as though realizing that the stories whispered in the classified corridors of his early career had not been myths but warnings preserved for the day those buried truths would rise again. The commander remained beside her, though he stood more formally now, as if instinctively acknowledging that whatever rank she once held still carried influence that no erasure, no burial, and no bureaucratic cleansing could strip away. The soldiers, who had started the morning with a casual confidence belonging to young warriors accustomed to clear rules and visible threats, now found themselves reshaping their understanding of the world as they watched the quiet woman command the room without raising her voice or shifting her stance. A low chime resonated through the facility speakers, deeper and slower than the usual alert tone, and its effect on the officers was immediate. Every man with sufficient clearance stiffened, recognizing the sound as the activation of a protocol only triggered during catastrophic breaches of truth, integrity, or history. The admiral swallowed hard, unable to hide the slight tremor in his fingers as he addressed the room. "All personnel," he said, his voice louder now yet still strained, "stand at ceremonial attention." The order struck the room with the force of a sudden storm, and every soldier reacted instantly, their boots snapping together with a unified crack that reverberated through the walls, like the echo of a long-silenced anthem. Even the SEAL who had mocked her earlier moved with rigid precision, though the shame flickering behind his eyes revealed that the ceremonial stance felt more like an apology he could not yet voice. The admiral stepped forward, his posture tightening as he positioned himself directly in front of her, and the two lieutenant colonels flanked him on either side with solemn expressions. "This formation," the admiral said, projecting his voice with the authority of a man relearning his place, "is no longer for me." He turned slowly toward her, and the act felt less like a gesture between officers and more like the acknowledgement of a truth that had finally surfaced after years of silence. "It is for you," he continued, "because the system has recognized what we failed to see." And a silence followed that seemed to suspend time, and several soldiers felt their throats tighten as the meaning of the admiral's declaration sank in. The commander lowered his head in a subtle but unmistakable gesture of respect, and the ripple that followed spread through the ranks like a wave of gravity reorienting the room around a new center. The woman stood still as stone, her expression unreadable, though something in her gaze softened for the first time a flicker of sorrow more than pride, as if the ceremony unfolding before her was less an honor and more a reminder of everything lost to the mission that refused to die. One of the lieutenant colonels stepped forward hesitantly, carrying a small identification tablet usually reserved for top-tier verification processes, and he held it out with the caution of someone handling an artifact that might rewrite his understanding of the world. "If you place your thumb here," he said quietly, "the system will confirm your identity in a permanent record." She looked at the device for a long moment, and the soldiers sensed she was weighing not the security risk, but the emotional cost of allowing the past to bind her again. After a brief pause, she placed her thumb on the scanner. The tablet pulsed once, then twice, before emitting a deep, resonant tone that caused the admiral to stiffen and the commander to inhale sharply. A line of text appeared across the screen, and the lieutenant colonel's expression shifted from disbelief to awe as he read the result aloud in a trembling voice. "Identity confirmed," he whispered. "Widow 6, active designation." The room absorbed the announcement like a seismic wave, and several soldiers felt their knees weaken despite the formality of their stance. Her codename, once spoken only behind layers of encryption and sealed doors, had returned to the world with frightening clarity, and every officer present understood that no power on the base could override what the system had just recognized. The admiral took a step backward, not out of fear but out of reverence, and his voice softened into something almost ceremonial. "Then this base," he said slowly, "stands at your service." And she lifted her chin slightly, though her expression held no triumph, only the quiet burden of someone who had hoped never to hear those words again. The commander met her eyes with a deep, unspoken understanding, a recognition that she had never sought power, but power had never released its hold on her. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the steady resolve of someone who had accepted the weight of her past, even as the future began to tighten around them. "Do not serve me," she said, her tone cool and measured. "Serve the truth." The admiral nodded, though his eyes flickered with tension as the intercom crackled again, this time delivering a garbled fragment that made every soldier's heart thud against their ribs. A distorted voice, buried beneath static, struggled through the speaker with a message that chilled the entire formation. "Inbound, unregistered, code pattern, unknown, approaching fast." And the room tensed instantly, and the commander turned toward her with the sharp awareness of a man who had just realized that the ceremony, marking her recognition, was not the end of the storm but the lightning before impact. She exhaled slowly, her posture tightening with the quiet readiness of someone stepping once more into a role she had tried so hard to leave behind. "They found us," she said softly, and in that moment, every soldier understood that the ceremony had not crowned a hero. It had summoned a battle none of them were prepared to face. The distorted transmission lingered in the air with a lingering static that felt more like a warning carried across a battlefield than a routine base alert, and every soldier in the room felt their pulse begin to climb, with the instinctive dread that arrives only when something unknown crosses the perimeter of a supposedly secure installation. The Admiral pivoted toward the nearest wall terminal with a stiffness that betrayed the tension coiling beneath his uniform, while the commander moved beside him in a single fluid motion that revealed years of combat reflex, still embedded in muscle memory. The woman remained exactly where she stood, positioned at the quiet center of the room's growing storm, her posture steady and unshaken despite the tightening voices, shifting boots, and flickering lights that signaled a threat approaching faster than the base's protocols could process. The lieutenant colonel at the console began typing furiously, yet every request he entered returned the same frustrating message. Undefined contact, no authorization, no signature tracking suspended. A ripple of unease spread through the ranks as soldiers exchanged tense glances, each man realizing the gravity of encountering an object that not only bypassed base identification systems, but actively resisted tracking attempts, which was something only the most dangerous Black Ops units possessed the ability to accomplish. The Admiral leaned closer to the screen, his voice sharp with urgency as he demanded more data, though the tremor hiding beneath his tone betrayed a deeper fear he could not mask. "Give me altitude, vector, anything," he said, and the lieutenant colonel's voice cracked with pressure as he responded, "It's holding a glide pattern outside standard airframe physics, sir, and its speed is fluctuating like it's adjusting to our scans." The commander felt his breath tighten, recognizing the signature not as an anomaly but as a deliberate maneuver, the kind performed only by operatives trained to slip between digital shadows and avoid detection at any cost. He turned toward her, and the unspoken question in his eyes revealed more than any briefing could. But she didn't look back at him. Instead, her gaze drifted toward the high windows near the top of the training hall, as though she were waiting for a silhouette she had spent years trying to forget. The tension in her jaw tightened subtly, and the soldiers closest to her felt the shift before they understood it, sensing the arrival of a threat not measured by technology but by history. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet certainty that froze the officers mid-motion. "It's not here to strike the base," she said, her words falling heavy with the weight of knowledge earned on ridges burned into memory. "It's here to confirm I'm alive." The Admiral inhaled sharply, realizing that a reconnaissance approach meant someone had already succeeded in breaching at least one layer of national defense, and the commander's eyes widened with dread at the implications. "If they've found you this quickly," the commander said, his tone low yet resolute, "then they anticipated the protocol activating, and they're moving faster than we expected." She nodded once, the restrained motion carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent years avoiding precisely this moment, and the soldiers watched in solemn silence as she seemed to age a decade in the quiet space between heartbeats. The lieutenant colonel's voice trembled as he read another line of data appearing on the terminal. "Object is descending," he announced, turning toward the officers with panic rising in his expression. "It's not approaching the landing strip or the drone fields, it's coming toward the west maintenance sector." The Admiral stiffened, instantly recognizing that sector as one of the least fortified and least monitored areas of the base, often used for storage, mechanical testing, and unclassified equipment inspections. "Seal that entire wing," he ordered. But before the system could respond, the lights across the training room dimmed abruptly, casting everything into a cold half-darkness that sharpened the edges of every shadow. The soldiers instinctively tightened their formation, the sound of boots scuffing lightly against the floor echoing like distant thunder in a valley. The commander's hand drifted toward his sidearm before halting, as though realizing that whatever approached would not be deterred by ordinary weapons. She stepped forward at last, her movement controlled and unhurried, the kind of deliberate motion that drew the soldiers' attention like a gravity they couldn't escape, and her voice softened into a tone edged with quiet inevitability. "This is not a breach to repel," she said, meeting the commander's gaze with a calm that unsettled even the Admiral. "This is a message, The SEAL, who had mocked her earlier, finally found the courage to speak, though his voice shook with the raw vulnerability of someone confronting a consequence far beyond his earlier arrogance. What kind of message lands in a blind sector without a signature? She turned toward him, and the faint sorrow in her expression made him lower his gaze instinctively before she spoke. "The kind sent by someone who knows I will understand it," she replied, her tone steady enough to silence the tension in the room. "And someone who knows the rest of you won't." Outside, a distant metallic thud reverberated across the base grounds, subtle yet heavy enough to vibrate through the floor beneath their boots, and several soldiers flinched as though expecting the sound to be followed by alarms or gunfire. Instead, the facility fell into an even deeper silence, the kind that feels alive, listening, waiting to see which side of history will speak next. The Admiral exchanged a grave look with the commander, and the unspoken panic passing between them revealed the truth neither man dared to say aloud. Whatever had landed outside the base had bypassed every line of detection. And that meant the threat was not only internal, but personal. The commander stepped closer to her, lowering his voice to a tone only she could hear. "Do you think it's them?" he asked, though he already sensed the answer in the tension coiled inside her silence. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling through the ghosts of memories she had buried under years of forced anonymity, and her voice emerged with a haunting clarity that made every soldier feel the temperature of the room drop. "They didn't send a strike team," she said softly. "They sent a survivor." The room froze, because every man now understood the most terrifying truth of all. Whatever had come for her was not an enemy. It was someone who had walked through the same fire and carried the same scars and now stood on the other side of the base walls, waiting for her to answer. For a long moment after her final words, the training room held its breath as though the entire facility were waiting for the truth to assemble itself from fragments of memory and dust. A truth too heavy to confront, yet too loud to ignore now that the past had found its way back to the present. The Admiral stared at her with an expression torn between disbelief and dawning horror, as if trying to calculate the statistical impossibility of a second survivor emerging from an operation officially listed as a total loss event. The commander shifted subtly beside her, his jaw tightening with a protective instinct sharpened by the knowledge that whatever or whoever had arrived outside the base had not come without intention. She remained silent, though the stillness in her eyes revealed the fault lines running beneath her composure, cracks formed by a past she had never allowed herself to revisit. Her breathing remained steady, but something in her posture had changed. She now carried herself not as a ghost of 127, but as someone preparing to confront the last person in the world who could drag her back into the fire she had spent years escaping. The soldiers closest to her sensed the shift instinctively, stepping back half an inch without realizing they had moved, as though unconsciously acknowledging that she was transitioning from one identity to another, neither of which they fully understood. The lieutenant colonel returned his attention to the console with trembling hands, and the flickering data stream revealed an object now resting in the far maintenance yard, its silhouette blurred by a haze of exhaust that looked too clean and too precise to belong to any registered aircraft on the base. He swallowed hard as he read the thermal scan, his voice cracking slightly when he announced, "There's one figure outside the craft, sir, standing still, like they're waiting for something." The Admiral exhaled sharply, and his voice tightened as he asked, "Are they armed?" The lieutenant colonel frowned, squinting at the feed with growing confusion before shaking his head slowly. "Not visibly," he replied, "but their stance suggests they're trained, balanced, grounded, not exposing centerline." The commander stepped forward, recognizing the description immediately, and a chill crept up his spine as he whispered, "That's special operations posture, not infiltration posture." The room chilled as the implication sank in, because whoever stood outside the base had not arrived like an attacker, they had arrived like a soldier, reporting for a mission long overdue. The SEAL cleared his throat nervously, clearly wrestling with the remnants of his earlier arrogance, and he finally found the courage to ask the question gnawing at every man in the room. "Ma'am," he began hesitantly, "if someone survived with you, why didn't they return sooner?" She inhaled, and for the first time since entering the base, her gaze drifted toward the floor as though she were reliving a moment carved deep into the marrow of her memory, a moment formed by fire, betrayal, and choices no soldier should ever have to make. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a hollow weight that made several soldiers straighten with instinctive respect. "Because not everyone who survives," she said quietly, "returns as themselves." The Admiral frowned, not understanding. "Meaning?" he pressed, though the answer had already begun forming in the strained silence around them. She lifted her eyes slowly, and the sorrow etched in them was sharper than any blade. "Survival isn't the same as returning," she said, "and the ones who walk away sometimes carry more darkness than the ones who fall." A flicker of movement near the window drew the commander's attention, and he stepped closer to the glass with a caution shaped by years of reading the subtleties of threat perception. Beyond the fence line, partially obscured by maintenance scaffolding, stood the lone figure motionless, upright, and facing the training hall with a stillness too deliberate to be accidental. The commander felt his breath catch, because even at a distance he recognized the rigidity in that posture, the same disciplined stillness he'd once seen in men waiting for extraction that would never come. "She knows them," the commander murmured with certainty, turning back toward the Admiral. "Whoever that is, they're not here to declare war, they're here to deliver something." The Admiral's expression hardened at the implication, and he gave a terse nod before addressing the soldiers. "Prepare a controlled intercept," he ordered sharply, "but maintain distance until we understand their intent." But before the soldiers could react, she stepped forward. Her boots echoed softly across the floor, the sound steady and deliberate, each step carrying the weight of a decision no one else understood. The commander moved instinctively to intercept her, placing himself in her path with a tense mixture of loyalty and fear. "You don't have to face them alone," he said, his voice low yet intense. She met his gaze with a calm that shook him more than fear ever could. "I was alone when this started," she replied softly, "and they were alone when it ended." He opened his mouth to argue, but something in her eyes silenced him, something shaped by sacrifice and silence and the knowledge that the past demanded its own reckoning, one neither rank nor protocol could shield her from. The Admiral watched her with a growing dread, recognizing that she was preparing to walk into a confrontation built not from orders or duty, but from the threads of a shared tragedy that had never been severed. As she approached the door, the soldiers parted instinctively, creating a narrow path as though guided by an unspoken understanding that this moment was not theirs to interrupt. The SEAL lowered his gaze as she passed, the earlier disrespect evaporated by a humility forged from fear and admiration, and even the younger soldiers stepped back with reverence, sensing that they were witnessing a moment carved from the deepest veins of military history. She reached the exit, pausing with her hand on the steel handle, and her voice drifted back through the room like a quiet command shaped by memory rather than authority. "Whatever you see out there," she said, "remember this. Not all survivors return seeking rescue. Some return seeking closure." The door opened slowly, allowing a sliver of harsh daylight to cut through the dim training hall, and the moment the outside air touched her face, something in her expression hardened with a resolve so absolute it made several soldiers hold their breath. Beyond the threshold, the lone figure stood waiting, still as a statue carved from the remains of their shared past, and the weight of that waiting pressed against the base like an approaching storm. The commander took a single step after her, but she lifted one hand without turning, stopping him with the quiet authority of someone who had once commanded units capable of rewriting the shadows of war. The message was clear. This path was hers alone, and as she crossed into the fading light, every soldier understood the terrifying truth forming on the horizon. The past had not come to haunt her. It had come to reclaim something, only she could decide to give. The sunlight outside struck her eyes with a sharpness that felt almost ceremonial, as if the world had chosen the exact moment she stepped through the steel doors to illuminate the path she had avoided for years. And every soldier watching from inside the training hall felt the air shift with a tension too heavy to swallow. She walked across the concrete with a steadiness shaped not by confidence but by resignation, moving with the quiet precision of someone who had rehearsed this confrontation in the silence of her own nightmares. The lone figure standing near the unregistered craft did not move, not even when she approached within a distance close enough for shadows to overlap, and the stillness between them thickened until it seemed to stretch across the entire base like a suspended wire ready to snap under the weight of memory. The commander watched from the doorway with a tension carved into the deepest lines of his posture, while the Admiral stood just behind him, his hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles whitened beneath the strain of interpreting a confrontation he did not understand. When she finally stopped walking, the survivor lifted their head with a slow, almost reverent motion, revealing a face worn by the same strain of hardship that marked her own, the kind etched not by time alone but by missions that devoured entire lifetimes in a matter of days. Their eyes held a familiarity so sharp it pierced the soldiers watching from a distance, and the quiet gasp that rippled through the formation inside the hall revealed that even without knowing the history, they understood the weight of the reunion before them. "You're alive," the survivor said, their voice low and cracked, sounding like a remnant of a battlefield whisper carried through layers of dust and forgotten radio frequencies. She didn't answer right away, because there was no language in any military manual capable of describing what it meant to stand before the last person who had seen her at the ridge where their unit had died. When she did speak, her voice emerged with the fragile steadiness of someone stitching together a truth that had been torn apart long ago. "So are you," she replied, the syllables falling into the space between them like pieces of a past they had both buried under silence. The survivor exhaled sharply, and for a moment their expression shifted with a flicker of something raw, anger, grief, or maybe relief sharpened by fear, but it vanished almost instantly as the reality of their situation settled back into their posture. Behind them, the base loudspeakers crackled as the system attempted another scan of the unidentified craft, and the automated voice sputtered through layers of static, reporting readings that made no logical sense. "Vessel signature unrecognized," the system declared. "Propulsion unknown, authorization required." The automated tone only deepened the unease, spreading through the ranks of soldiers who had now gathered near the windows and corridors, drawn by the magnetic pull of a scene that felt less like a confrontation and more like the resurrection of a legend. Her gaze drifted briefly toward the craft, and she felt a familiar chill at the sight of its angular form, too quiet and too deliberate to belong to any legitimate branch, a reminder of the clandestine network that had formed after 127 was sealed. She turned back to the survivor, who took a single step forward, their movements slow and controlled, revealing the same disciplined fluency she remembered from the ridge, the same way they had moved when covering the retreat that never came. "They'll come for us," the survivor murmured, their voice tight with a tension shaped by truths they could not speak in the open. "They already know you broke their silence by stepping on this base." She inhaled deeply, the weight of his words settling into the hollow spaces of her chest, because she understood better than anyone that their reappearance had not been an accident, but the beginning of an unraveling long delayed. "I didn't come to break anything," she said, her tone soft but unyielding. "The protocol found me because someone else started digging." The survivor clenched their jaw, and for the first time the soldiers saw the fracture of raw emotion crossing their features, revealing a depth of suffering that could only be carried by someone who had lived through the same inferno and walked out with scars too deep for medical files to document. "You shouldn't have resurfaced," the survivor whispered, though their voice cracked with something dangerously close to guilt. "You were the only one who could disappear cleanly." The wind carried the faint scent of jet fuel across the yard, swirling between them like a ghost of the ridge they had left behind, and she felt her breath tighten at the memory of bodies, smoke, and silence, the kind of silence that grows when comms cut out and the world decides not to come for you. She shook her head slowly, her eyes steady and unwavering. "I didn't resurface," she said, her voice carrying the quiet strength of finality. "The truth did." The survivor looked away for a moment, their shoulders tensing as though bracing against a storm only they could sense, and when they turned back to face her, the fear in their expression had sharpened into resolve. "They sent me," the survivor said, almost whispering the words, "to warn you." The admiral stiffened visibly at the statement, his mind racing through a dozen interpretations of what "they" could signify, none of which aligned with any official military doctrine. The commander took a step outside, moving closer but keeping his distance, because the tension between the two survivors felt sacred, fragile, and dangerous all at once. "Warn me about what?" she asked, the question falling between them like a small detonation. The survivor's eyes glistened with a mixture of dread and loyalty that only years of shared battle could forge, and their voice nearly failed when they finally answered. "They're coming to erase the rest of the story," the survivor said, each word trembling with urgency, "and you're the last piece they could never control." The soldiers watching from the entrance felt the weight of the admission strike them like a physical blow, and several exchanged uneasy glances as the implications unfolded in their minds. The admiral exhaled slowly, realizing that the threat they faced was not a foreign enemy but a shadow carved from their own history, a shadow that had grown teeth in the years since 127's disappearance. She took another step closer to the survivor, her voice lowering into something almost tender. "Why you?" she asked, though the answer already flickered across the survivor's haunted expression. They met her eyes with a raw honesty that carved through the tension like a blade. "Because I refuse to stay dead," they said, "and you refuse to stop being the truth." The air between them tightened, bending under the weight of an unspoken bond forged in a place the world had erased, and every soldier observing the moment understood the terrifying reality settling over the base. This was not a reunion. It was a warning delivered by the only person who had escaped the fire, with their soul still burning. Inside the training hall, the atmosphere thickened with an almost tangible electricity, as though the walls themselves sensed that the confrontation unfolding on the concrete outside had begun pulling threads buried deep within the base's most guarded archives, threads that were never meant to see daylight again. The Admiral stood rigidly at the terminal, staring at the flood of encrypted flags populating the screen with a speed that made the younger officers step backward, uncertain if they were witnessing a malfunction or a revelation too dangerous to acknowledge aloud. The commander remained at the doorway, watching her and the survivor, with an intensity sharpened by years of battlefield intuition, his posture revealing the inner conflict of a man torn between protecting her and allowing her to face the ghosts she had carried alone for far too long. The soldiers behind him crowded closer, drawn not by curiosity but by the gravity of history returning to life in real time, and each man realized instinctively that the world outside those steel doors was changing in ways none of them had been trained to understand. A sudden, heavy tone echoed through the hall as the base's master terminal forced itself into override mode, filling the room with a deep mechanical hum that made the fluorescent lights tremble faintly. The Admiral leaned in, his breath catching as the system displayed a message in a stark red font, the kind used only when the deepest layers of classified architecture were breaching their own silence. "Restricted Archive. Widow 6. Access reinstated." And the words struck the room like a sledgehammer, and several soldiers gasped involuntarily as the system continued unlocking sealed files with the methodical precision of a machine resurrecting a story that had been buried beneath years of intentional erasure. The commander stepped forward, unable to stop himself from moving closer, his jaw tightening as the first fragments of her classified records began appearing: deployment logs, redacted after-action reports, cross-branch assignments, and personnel anomalies too frequent to belong to any ordinary operator. The Admiral's voice trembled as he said, "This level of reinstatement doesn't happen automatically. Something or someone at the top authorized this before the protocol went dark." The lieutenant colonel swallowed hard as another wave of documents appeared, each file marking a point in time where she had operated behind layers of deniable clearance, her actions buried so deeply that even the people she saved had never learned her name. The system flashed again, this time displaying a single, chilling line: 127, primary survivor record found. He said. The room fell silent, the weight of the message pressing down with the cold certainty of a verdict that could not be appealed. The commander whispered under his breath, "They logged her survival," and the words struck the soldiers with the force of realization someone had known she lived and had chosen to bury the truth instead of retrieving her, a decision that felt more like betrayal than error. Meanwhile, outside, she faced the survivor with a stillness shaped by both dread and resolve, unaware of the cascade of classified acknowledgments unfolding behind her. The survivor's gaze shifted toward the hall, as if sensing the storm of revelation building within, and their voice dropped into a near whisper. "If they unlocked your file," they said, "then nothing you say here will remain contained." Huh. She exhaled softly, and her voice carried the resignation of someone who had already accepted that the truth, once awakened, refused to sleep again. "It was never going to stay contained," she murmured. "Not after you arrived." The survivor lowered their eyes, visibly pained by the truth in her statement, and the soldiers watching from the doorway felt the emotional gravity stretching between them with a force that made their chests tighten. Inside the hall, the Admiral scrolled through the newly opened archive, and his expression hardened as he reached a segment marked by a triple-layer red seal, the kind reserved for operations that had altered national directives. "Commander," he said quietly, turning the screen toward him, "you need to see this." The commander approached, leaning in with the caution of someone afraid of what he would find, and his breath stopped as the document unfolded across the screen. It was a mission analysis from the Ridge, a report detailing the last confirmed moments of 127, written not by a survivor but by a drone operator who had watched the fire roll across the hillside without being able to intervene. The text described how one operative had carried the injured beyond the blast radius, how another had stayed behind to reroute comms manually, and how a third unidentified figure had cut the uplink just seconds before the Ridge detonated. Then came the final line, written in a trembling hand. One remained unaccounted for. Smoke cleared. Figure seen walking east. The commander felt the blood drain from his face, as he realized the description matched her every movement, every detail, every decision that had haunted her silence. The soldiers behind him watched with wide eyes as the truth settled like dust, finally allowed to fall, and a reverent hush filled the hall as if the base itself recognized the magnitude of what had been recovered. Outside, the survivor took another step toward her, their voice thick with emotion. "They watched us burn," they said, their words cutting through the still air like a blade forged from betrayal. "And they let the world believe we were dead." She nodded slowly, her eyes carrying years of unspoken suffering, and when she finally responded, her voice carried a steadiness sharper than anger. "They buried the mission," she said, "but they couldn't bury us." The intercom crackled once more, this time with a clarity that made every soldier inside stiffen. The automated voice declared, "Widow 6 primary authority verified. Base command reassigned." Oh, the room erupted with a mixture of shock and awe as the system made its final declaration, and the commander felt his heart pound with the realization that the hierarchy of the entire installation had shifted, not by decision but by recognition. He turned toward the doorway, watching her silhouette in the fading light, and for a brief moment he saw not the quiet woman who had walked into their hall but the warrior fate had refused to erase. And as the survivor's shadow merged with hers on the ground, every soldier understood the truth rising around them like an oncoming tide. The past was no longer knocking. It had forced the doors open. The wind carried a low hum across the maintenance yard, brushing against the steel, siding with a whisper that felt strangely reverent, as though the base itself had bowed its head in the presence of truths it could no longer ignore or suppress. She stood facing the survivor with a steadiness carved from years of surviving in the shadows, her posture a quiet refusal to surrender to the weight of the past even as it pressed harder with every breath she took. Behind her, the commander stepped outside at last, moving with measured caution, as if afraid any sudden gesture might shatter the fragile boundary between history and the moment unfolding before them. The admiral followed a few paces behind, his expression carved into a mask of reluctant acceptance, realizing that command had shifted not by politics or appointment, but by recognition encoded in the deepest layers of a system older than his entire career. The survivor's gaze flickered between her and the distant hills that framed the horizon, as though expecting the ridge, the one soaked in ash and betrayal, to rise from memory and take physical form in the afternoon light. "It won't stop," they murmured, their voice threadbare with exhaustion and fear. "They will try to erase whatever is left of us until the last piece of the story is gone." She inhaled slowly, letting the breath settle into the hollow spaces the years had carved inside her, and when she answered, her voice carried a calm strength that cut through the tension like a beam of steady light. "Stories don't die because someone buried them," she said. "They die when the people who lived them stop standing." The survivor lowered their head, absorbing her words with the kind of reverence born from shared scars, and the soldiers watching from the doorway felt the air around them shift, as though her resolve had pulled something dormant from their own sense of duty. A soft chime echoed from the base loudspeakers, no longer the sharp, frantic tone of alerts, but a slow, resonant pulse acknowledging the completion of a protocol that had reshaped the chain of command in ways none of them could fully comprehend. Lights across the yard stabilized, their flicker replaced with a steady glow, and the automated voice spoke with a clarity that sent a shiver through every man within earshot. "Widow 6 recognized. Operational authority transferred. Awaiting directive." The commander stepped beside her now, not to lead or shield, but to stand witness, his voice low and anchored in quiet respect. "They're ready to follow," he said, "whether we understand the mission or not." She glanced at him with a faint, sorrowful gratitude, recognizing that his loyalty came not from protocol, but from the moral compass that guided him long before ranks were printed on their uniforms. She turned back to the survivor, who watched her with a mixture of hope and dread, as though torn between wanting her to pick up the mantle of their forgotten past and wishing she could finally walk away from the ghosts that had followed her across continents and years. "You know what comes next," the survivor said, their tone barely above a whisper. "You always knew." She nodded once, the gesture deliberate and solemn, carrying the weight of a decision she had avoided for too long. "If they're coming to finish the story," she replied, "then we decide how the last chapter is written." The survivor exhaled shakily, accepting the truth etched into her words, and the soldiers around them straightened unconsciously, sensing that the coming battle would be unlike anything their manuals had ever prepared them to face. The wind shifted again, curling around her boots and carrying the faint scent of engine fuel from the silent craft, the same craft that had delivered a survivor who should not exist, and a warning too heavy to ignore. She looked toward the fading light stretching across the yard, letting its warmth settle briefly on her skin, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the quiet conviction of someone born not for glory, but for duty. "Once a soldier," she said softly, "always a protector." "On?" The words flowed into the gathering silence like a promise forged from ashes and memory, and every man who heard them felt something inside their chest steady an anchor settling into place. She stepped forward, the survivor falling into stride beside her, and together they began walking toward the unknown horizon awaiting them beyond the perimeter fence. And as the sun dipped lower, casting their shadows long across the concrete, the base understood one final truth. She had not returned to reclaim a title. She had returned to defend a world that had forgotten the cost of its own survival.